St. Maercy Hospital loomed like a malevolent giant against the night sky, its once proud facade now a decaying monument to the horrors within. Agent John Graves stared at the crumbling building from the safety of his vehicle, the bitter taste of dread already creeping up his throat. He'd seen his share of terror, but something about this assignment felt different, worse. Beside him, Dr. Ellen Parker shifted uneasily, her eyes fixed on the hospital's darkened windows, which seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "This place is wrong," she muttered, almost to herself. Graves nodded, checking his gear for the third time. "Let's just get in, figure out what's going on, and get out." Their orders had been cryptic: investigate the resurgence of paranormal activity in St. Maercy Hospital. The place had been sealed off decades ago after a series of unexplained deaths. But recently, the locals had started whispering about strange lights and screams coming from inside. The government couldn't afford another public scare, so they'd sent in Graves' team, professionals in dealing with the unexplainable. The team assembled outside the entrance: Marcus Kane, the tech genius with his arsenal of ghost-hunting gadgets, and Samara Reyes, the no-nonsense field agent who could handle anything, living or dead. They exchanged nods, their usual banter absent in the face of the hospital's oppressive presence. The massive steel doors creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty halls, like the moan of a wounded beast. The air inside was thick with the scent of mold and something far more foul: rotting flesh, though none was visible. Graves took point, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and shattered tiles. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere deep within. They moved cautiously through the hospital's main corridor, past the nurse's station, where old medical charts still lay scattered, untouched for years. As they approached the psychiatric wing, the atmosphere grew colder, as if the hospital itself was warning them to turn back. Graves ignored it, pushing open the door to the wing. The lights flickered ominously, revealing the horrors of the past. Rusty shackles still attached to beds, the walls covered in desperate scratch marks. Dr. Parker shuddered, her breath visible in the freezing air. But it wasn't just the cold that sent chills down their spines. It was the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. A sudden noise made them all jump, footsteps heavy and deliberate, coming from the darkness ahead. Graves raised his weapon, motioning for silence. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just out of sight. The team held their breath, the tension suffocating. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. A man in a blood-stained lab coat, his eyes hollow and lifeless. The surgeon. He raised a scalpel, the blade glinting wickedly in the flickering light. And then, with a shriek that echoed through the halls, he lunged. The surgeon's attack was swift and brutal, his scalpel slicing through the air with deadly precision. Graves barely dodged the first swipe, the blade missing his throat by mere inches. Samara reacted instinctively, drawing her weapon and firing off 2 shots. The bullets passed through the surgeon as if he were made of smoke, embedding harmlessly into the wall behind him. "Fall back," Graves shouted, grabbing Dr. Parker and pulling her back towards the door. The surgeon's hollow eyes locked onto them, his twisted smile stretching impossibly wide as he advanced. Marcus fumbled with his equipment, desperately trying to activate the EMP device strapped to his chest. Come on," he muttered, his fingers trembling. Finally, the device hummed to life, emitting a pulse that sent a ripple through the air. The surgeon flickered, his form distorting as if caught in a bad signal. But then, with a guttural snarl, he reformed, unaffected by the electromagnetic burst. "He's not like the others," Marcus breathed, eyes wide with fear. "He's stronger." The team retreated down the corridor, but the hospital seemed to shift around them, the walls narrowing, the floor tilting. It was as if the building itself was alive, twisting and contorting to trap them. They stumbled into an intersection, 3 corridors stretching out before them, each one dark and uninviting. "We need to get out of here," Samara hissed, her voice strained. "We're sitting ducks." But as they debated which path to take, a low growl echoed from one of the corridors, followed by the sound of skittering feet. From the shadows emerged a swarm of crawlers, their spider-like bodies scuttling along the walls and ceiling, human faces twisted in expressions of eternal torment. The team barely had time to react before the creatures were upon them, fangs bared. Graves fired his weapon, the bullets tearing through the crawler's flesh, but for every one he killed, 2 more took its place. Samara and Marcus fought desperately to hold them back, while Dr. Parker, shaken and pale, tried to find a way out. The crawlers hissed and spat, their claws slashing through the air, leaving deep, bloody gashes on anything they touched. In the chaos, Graves spotted a door at the end of one of the corridors. "This way!" he shouted, leading the charge. The team fought their way through the swarm, blood and ichor splattering the walls as they hacked and shot their way forward. They burst through the door and slammed it shut behind them, the crawlers' enraged screeches muffled by the thick wood. They found themselves in the old surgical ward, the air heavy with the stench of blood and antiseptic. The operating tables were still stained with the dark, dried blood of the surgeon's victims. The room was eerily silent, but the team knew better than to trust it. As they caught their breath, the lights flickered again, casting long, menacing shadows across the room. One of those shadows moved, detaching itself from the wall and taking form. A tall, thin figure with glowing red eyes and a grin full of sharp teeth. The shadow man stepped forward, his voice a whisper that chilled them to their core. "You shouldn't have come here. Now you'll never leave." The team realized with growing dread that their nightmare was far from over. The shadow man's grin seemed to stretch impossibly wide, his eyes burning like coals in the darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a dense, unnatural fog began to creep along the floor, swirling around the team's ankles. Graves could feel the icy tendrils of fear wrapping around his spine, but he forced himself to focus. "Everyone stay close," Graves commanded, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to keep his composure. "We don't know what this thing is capable of." Marcus, already pale from the encounter with the crawlers, fumbled with his equipment. EMP didn't work on the surgeon. Maybe it'll have some effect on this thing. But as he reached for the device, the shadow man laughed, a deep, echoing sound that filled the room with an unsettling resonance. The lights flickered again, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, forming grotesque shapes that danced and writhed as if they were alive. "You think your toys can stop me?" the shadow man hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "I've been here long before you were even born, feeding on the fear and despair of those who wandered into my domain. You're nothing but prey." With a snap of his fingers, the shadow man summoned the fog to rise, engulfing the room in thick, choking darkness. The team was plunged into near-complete blindness, the only sound the eerie whispers of the shadow man, echoing all around them. "We need to move now," Graves shouted, panic rising in his chest as he strained to see anything through the oppressive mist. But it was too late. The fog seemed to come alive, coiling around them like a serpent, separating them one by one. Graves could hear Samara's frantic breathing somewhere to his left, but she was out of reach, her silhouette barely visible through the haze. Marcus's muttered curses came from the right, but they too faded as the fog thickened. Then the first scream pierced the air, a high-pitched, blood-curdling wail that echoed endlessly in the confined space. It was Dr. Parker. Graves tried to push through the fog toward her, but the shadows reached out, clawing at his limbs, dragging him back. Another scream, this one more desperate, more terrified. "Marcus!" His voice was cut off suddenly, as if silenced by an unseen force. Graves' heart raced as he fought against the shadows, but the more he struggled, the tighter their grip became. The fog thinned just enough for him to catch a glimpse of the shadow man, his face mere inches from Graves' own, his grin as wide and wicked as ever. "You can't save them," he whispered. "They're already mine." The fog lifted just enough to reveal the horrors around him. Samara was pinned to the wall by shadowy tendrils, her eyes wide with terror, blood streaming from fresh cuts on her face. Dr. Parker was sprawled on the floor, her body twitching as if she was being electrocuted by invisible forces. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. "Let them go," Graves shouted, but his voice cracked with fear, betraying his growing helplessness. The shadow man's laugh filled the room again, cold and mocking. "Why should I? This is only the beginning. You've entered my world now, and there's no escape." Graves' mind raced as he struggled to think of a way out, but every idea seemed futile. The shadow man was playing with them, savoring their fear. And as the shadows closed in, he realized with a sinking dread that they were completely at its mercy. Graves' breath came in ragged gasps as the shadows closed in, inching closer with every heartbeat. The walls of the hospital seemed to pulse, alive with the dark energy that the shadowman had summoned. Samara's strained whimpers echoed in his ears, but he was helpless, caught in the malevolent grip of the entity before him. Suddenly, the fog swirled violently, and a loud, metallic crash reverberated through the room. The lights flickered once more, and then, as if by some unseen force, the shadows recoiled, retreating to the corners of the room. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on Graves' chest lifted slightly, and he could finally breathe again. Samara dropped to the floor, gasping for air, her face pale and streaked with blood. Dr. Parker lay unconscious, her body twitching with aftershocks from whatever torment she had endured. Graves crawled to her side, checking her pulse. It was weak, but she was still alive. The shadowman, however, was nowhere to be seen. The fog still lingered, but it had thinned considerably, allowing Graves to see the room more clearly. That was when he noticed the blood, thick, dark pools of it spreading across the floor from where Marcus had been standing moments before. But there was no sign of Marcus. Where did he go? Samara choked out, her voice trembling as she tried to steady herself. Graves shook his head, his mind racing. I don't know, but we need to find him before it's too late. As they gathered their remaining strength, the hospital itself seemed to groan, the walls creaking and shifting as if the building was alive, reacting to the darkness within. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. It was clear that St. Maercy Hospital was no ordinary haunted site. It was a living, breathing entity, corrupted by the malevolent forces that had taken root within its walls. Graves and Samara moved cautiously through the surgical ward, every step echoing ominously in the empty space. The further they ventured, the more twisted and decayed the hospital became. Bloodstains smeared the walls, old and fresh, as if the building itself had been feeding off the terror of its victims for decades. The oppressive stench of decay and death grew stronger, nearly overwhelming them. They entered what appeared to be a morgue, the cold air biting at their skin. Rows of steel drawers lined the walls, some ajar, revealing the decayed remains within. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaking pipe. Samara's hand shook as she reached for one of the drawers, but Graves stopped her. Don't, he whispered. We're not alone. From the shadows at the far end of the room, a low growl rumbled, deep and menacing. Graves aimed his flashlight in the direction of the sound, revealing the source. A massive, hulking creature, its skin pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was neither human nor animal, something twisted and monstrous, born from the hospital's darkest secrets. The creature snarled, revealing rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth, and then it lunged, its long, clawed arms reaching for them. Graves fired his weapon, the bullets tearing through its flesh, but the beast didn't slow down. It was as if the hospital itself was protecting it, feeding it power. Run! Graves shouted, grabbing Samara's arm and pulling her toward the door. They barely made it out, slamming the heavy steel door shut behind them as the creature crashed into it with a force that shook the walls. The door held, but the sound of the beast's claws scratching at the metal sent shivers down their spines. This place is cursed, Samara whispered, her voice trembling with fear. We have to get out of here. But as they fled deeper into the hospital, they both knew that escape was no longer an option. St. Maercy had claimed them, and there was no way out. The eerie silence that engulfed the hallways of St. Maercy Hospital was suddenly pierced by a low, echoing moan that reverberated through the walls. Graves and Samara froze, their breath catching in their throats as the sound grew louder, closer, like a distant cry for help twisted into something monstrous. The hospital, with its labyrinth of decaying rooms and shadowy corridors, seemed to pulse with malevolence, as if it were alive, feeding on the terror it had bred for decades. We need to find Marcus, Graves muttered, gripping his flashlight tightly, the beam flickering as if even the light was afraid to push back the encroaching darkness. Samara nodded, her face pale, eyes wide with dread. But where? It's like this place is shifting, trying to trap us. As they moved deeper into the hospital, the air grew colder, the walls sweating with moisture that smelled faintly of decay. The shadows here were thicker, more oppressive, clinging to them like wet blankets. They passed through a set of rusted double doors that creaked ominously, entering a ward labeled Pediatrics. But there was nothing childlike about the place now. The walls were lined with empty, rotting cribs, some overturned, others still swaying slightly as if disturbed by unseen hands. The paint had long peeled away, revealing a sickly, greenish hue beneath, and the floor was sticky with something dark and foul. Graves' stomach churned as he stepped carefully around the decaying toys scattered across the floor. Dolls with missing eyes, teddy bears torn apart, their stuffing soaked in dark stains. What happened here? Samara whispered, her voice trembling. A sudden movement caught Graves' eye, and he swung his flashlight toward the far end of the room. The beam landed on a figure standing in the shadows, a small child, its head bowed. For a moment, hope surged in his chest, until the child lifted its head, revealing hollow black pits where eyes should have been. "Oh God!" Samara breathed, taking a step back. The child opened its mouth, but instead of a cry, a guttural, inhuman screech erupted, the sound echoing off the walls. The other cribs began to rattle violently, the whole room shaking as if caught in an earthquake. Graves stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor, plunging them into near darkness. In the dim light, the child began to move toward them, its limbs jerking unnaturally, bones cracking as it advanced. The screeching grew louder, joined by whispers, voices that seemed to come from all around them, from the very walls themselves. Graves scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, his fingers slick with sweat as he finally managed to flick it back on. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the child again, but it wasn't alone anymore. Dozens of spectral figures stood behind it, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence, all with the same hollow eyes, all staring at Graves and Samara. "Get out!" the voices screamed in unison, the sound so loud it made their ears ring. Graves didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Samara's arm, pulling her toward the exit as the ghosts closed in, their hands outstretched, reaching for them. They burst through the doors, slamming them shut behind them, just as the specters collided with the wood, their wails echoing down the hallway. But there was no time to catch their breath. The hospital was coming alive, the walls shaking as if in anger, lights bursting overhead, plunging them into a flickering nightmare. They were being herded, driven deeper into the bowels of St. Maercy, toward a place where even the shadows dared not venture. The floor beneath Graves' feet shifted suddenly, tilting as though the hospital itself was trying to throw him off balance. Samara clung to the wall for support, her wide eyes darting around as the hallway seemed to stretch and contract, the walls narrowing and then widening again, warping in ways that defied logic. The smell of sulfur hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of blood. "This isn't just a haunting," Samara whispered, her voice barely audible over the low growl that now rumbled through the building. "It's like the whole place is possessed." Graves could feel it too, a malevolent presence that permeated every inch of the hospital. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a living entity, filled with anger and pain, and it was out for blood. The deeper they ventured, the more the hospital seemed to react, as if it was trying to trap them, consume them whole. They turned a corner and found themselves in a stairwell, the steps descending into darkness. A dim, reddish light flickered from below, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The growling was louder here, almost deafening, and the air was thick with heat, making it difficult to breathe. Graves hesitated at the top of the stairs, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But there was no way out, not now. Whatever was down there, they had to face it if they were going to survive. He exchanged a glance with Samara, who nodded, her face pale but determined. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. They descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under their weight. The light grew brighter as they neared the bottom, and with it came the unmistakable stench of death. The walls here were covered in deep, gouging scratches, as if something with claws had tried to tear its way out or in. At the bottom of the stairs, they stepped into a massive chamber, its floor cracked and uneven, filled with a thick, bubbling liquid that glowed a sickly red. The heat was unbearable, waves of it radiating off the pool like a furnace. But it wasn't just the heat that made Graves' skin crawl. It was the feeling of being watched, of hundreds of unseen eyes glaring at them from the darkness. In the center of the chamber, a large pit yawned open, its edges lined with jagged rocks. The growling emanated from within, a deep guttural sound that vibrated through the floor. Graves shone his flashlight into the pit, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The pit was filled with bodies, hundreds of them, their flesh charred and decaying, their faces twisted in eternal agony. And at the very bottom, something moved. Something massive, with eyes that glowed like hot coals, its form shifting and undulating as it crawled up toward them. "It's the source," Samara gasped, her voice trembling. "The source of all this evil." Before they could react, the creature surged out of the pit, its massive, shadowy form filling the chamber. It let out a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the hospital, its claws slashing through the air, aiming straight for them. Graves and Samara dove to the side as the creature's claws ripped through the ground where they had stood moments before, sending chunks of concrete flying. The beast roared again, its eyes locked onto them, filled with a burning hatred that made the shadows around them tremble. "This is it," Graves thought, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "We're going to die here." Graves and Samara bolted toward the far side of the chamber, desperate to put distance between themselves and the nightmarish creature. But the hospital wasn't done with them yet. The walls seemed to close in, warping and twisting as they ran, as if the entire building was folding in on itself. The air grew thick with a rancid, choking smell, and the temperature dropped sharply, their breath now visible in the freezing air. The creature let out another bone-rattling roar, shaking the chamber and sending shockwaves through the ground. Graves felt his feet slipping on the cracked floor, losing his balance and crashing to the ground. He scrambled to get up, his heart pounding, but something in the shadows caught his eye. A figure, hunched and gaunt, standing in the corner. "Samara!" he shouted, pointing toward the figure. She turned, and her eyes widened in horror. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face that was both familiar and grotesquely distorted. It was Marcus, but his features were twisted into a mask of agony, his eyes hollow and lifeless. His skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over his bones, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Help me!" Marcus croaked, his voice barely audible, as if it came from some distant place. Samara rushed toward him, but Graves grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "No, that's not Marcus anymore." Before they could react, the creature roared again, its massive form lunging toward them. Marcus let out a blood-curdling scream, his body convulsing violently as the shadows around him seemed to come alive, wrapping around him like tendrils. They pulled him back into the darkness, his screams echoing through the chamber until they were abruptly cut off. "Run!" Graves yelled, dragging Samara with him. They sprinted across the chamber, dodging falling debris as the ceiling above them cracked and crumbled. The creature was right behind them, its claws slashing through the air, tearing chunks of concrete from the walls. The ground shook with each step it took, and the pit behind them rumbled, as if something even worse was waiting below. They reached a set of rusted double doors and slammed into them with all their might. The doors creaked open just enough for them to squeeze through, and they stumbled into another corridor, slamming the doors shut behind them. Graves shoved a nearby cabinet in front of the doors, but he knew it wouldn't hold for long. The corridor was long and narrow, lined with flickering lights that cast eerie shadows on the walls. Bloodstains marked the floor, leading further into the darkness, and the sound of distant whispers filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. "This place is trying to drive us mad," Samara muttered, her voice trembling. "It's like it's feeding off our fear." Graves nodded, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They were trapped, and the hospital was warping reality around them, twisting it into something out of a nightmare. He knew they had to keep moving, but with every step, the dread grew, gnawing at his sanity. As they ventured deeper into the corridor, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer just voices, they were screams. The walls began to pulse, oozing a dark, viscous liquid that dripped onto the floor, creating puddles of something that smelled of decay. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. And then, from the darkness ahead, came the sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps that echoed down the corridor. Graves felt a chill run down his spine as a tall, shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. The figure stopped, raising a hand, and the darkness around it seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive. "There's no escape," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow, sending a wave of terror through Graves and Samara. "The hospital is hungry." The figure advanced slowly, each step echoing like a death knell in the suffocating silence. Graves and Samara backed away, their eyes locked on the shadowy form as it moved with a deliberate, menacing grace. The red eyes beneath the hood glowed brighter, casting a sickly light that illuminated the walls around them. Walls now covered in pulsating, black veins that seemed to throb in time with their racing hearts. "We need to move," Graves hissed, grabbing Samara's hand and pulling her further down the corridor. But no matter how fast they ran, the shadowy figure seemed to close the distance effortlessly, its footsteps a constant, maddening rhythm behind them. They reached the end of the corridor and burst through another set of doors, finding themselves in what looked like an old surgical theater. The room was circular, with tiered seating rising up around a central operating table. The walls were lined with decaying medical equipment, and the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and blood. The overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the room like sinister specters. In the center of the room, the operating table was stained with dark, dried blood. Restraints dangled from its sides, and the surgical instruments laid out on a tray beside it were rusted and sharp, as if they had been used recently. The room seemed frozen in time, a snapshot of horrors past. But there was no time to take it all in. The doors behind them slammed open, and the shadowy figure entered the room, its presence sucking the warmth from the air. Graves and Samara backed away, their eyes wide with fear as the figure raised its hand, the darkness around it swirling like a storm. "We're trapped," Samara whispered, her voice barely audible. Graves' mind raced as he searched for a way out, but the only exit was the door they had just come through, and it was now blocked by the figure. The walls pulsed with an unnatural energy, the veins growing thicker, spreading across the room like a web. The surgical lights above flickered wildly, casting eerie, strobe-like flashes that made the room feel even more unreal. The figure stepped closer, and with a sudden violent motion, it slammed its hand down on the operating table. The ground shook, and a wave of dark energy erupted from the point of impact, spreading outwards in a circle. The energy hit Graves and Samara like a physical force, knocking them off their feet and sending them crashing into the walls. Graves struggled to stand, his vision swimming, but the darkness was closing in. The veins on the walls pulsed faster, oozing a thick black liquid that began to pool on the floor. The liquid bubbled and hissed, filling the room with the stench of decay and rot. Samara let out a scream as she tried to scramble to her feet, but the liquid was spreading, thickening, rising up to her ankles and pulling her down. The shadowy figure moved closer, its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger, its voice a whisper that cut through the chaos like a blade. "Feed the hospital," it intoned, the words dripping with malice. "Feed it with your fear, your pain, your souls." The liquid was up to their knees now, pulling them down with an impossible strength. Graves clawed at the walls, trying to find something to hold on to, but the veins were slick and pulsing, offering no purchase. The darkness was overwhelming, pressing in on all sides, and the figure loomed over them, its hand outstretched, ready to claim them. Just as the liquid reached their waists, something snapped inside Graves. A primal, desperate instinct took over, and he let out a roar of defiance, throwing himself at the shadowy figure with all his strength. The impact sent them both crashing into the operating table, the force of it shattering the darkness that had filled the room. For a brief moment, the room was silent, the oppressive energy dissipating like smoke. Graves lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. But as he looked up, He realized with horror that the figure was still there, standing over him, its form flickering like a dying flame. And then the figure began to laugh, a deep guttural sound that echoed off the walls and sent chills down Graves' spine. It was a sound that promised nothing but pain, a sound that heralded the true horror that was yet to come. Graves' defiant roar still echoed in his mind, but the haunting laughter of the shadowy figure was drowning it out. The liquid darkness receded, but only slightly, as if savoring the torment before delivering the final blow. Samara pulled herself up, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the flickering figure. "This isn't real," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "This can't be real." "It's real enough to kill us," Graves rasped, forcing himself to stand. He felt the cold bite of the room's oppressive energy, as though it were alive and aware of their every fear. They had no time to dwell on what they'd just faced. The shadowy figure was shifting, its form becoming less solid, more like smoke, but no less dangerous. Graves noticed the dark veins along the walls pulsing faster, as if they were feeding off the fear in the room. The hospital wanted more. "We need to destroy it," Graves muttered, glancing around the room. "This whole place, it's like a living thing. There must be a heart, a source." Samara's eyes snapped to the operating table, her mind racing. The basement. There was something down there when we arrived. A room we didn't explore. Before Graves could answer, the shadowy figure lunged. It moved with an unnatural speed, its form dissolving into tendrils of darkness that shot towards them like spears. Graves barely managed to shove Samara out of the way as one of the tendrils pierced the wall where her head had been seconds before. "Go!" Graves shouted, pushing her toward the door. "Run!" They bolted from the surgical theater, sprinting down the warped corridors that twisted like a maze. The walls seemed to close in, and the lights flickered sporadically, casting grotesque shadows that writhed like living things. Behind them, the tendrils of darkness snaked along the walls, chasing them with relentless speed. The hospital itself seemed to shift and change, trying to trap them, but they kept moving, driven by a primal instinct to survive. They burst through a set of double doors and found themselves in the main atrium. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood, and the eerie silence was broken only by their ragged breaths. At the far end of the atrium, an old elevator waited, its doors slightly ajar. "The basement," Samara panted. "We have to get to the basement." They dashed to the elevator and crammed inside, frantically pressing the button for the basement. The doors creaked shut, and the elevator shuddered as it descended. The lights inside flickered, and for a moment, Graves thought they were about to plunge into darkness again, but the elevator kept moving. As they neared the basement, a deep, resonant hum began to vibrate through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. It was a sound that vibrated in their bones, a sound that spoke of ancient, malevolent power. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit corridor that led to a large steel door at the end. The hum was deafening now, as if the very heart of the hospital was calling to them. "This is it," Graves muttered, stepping out of the elevator. "This is where we end this nightmare." The corridor felt impossibly long, each step toward the steel door echoing like the tolling of a bell. The walls here were different, smooth, cold, and metallic, without the veins or cracks that had marked the rest of the hospital. The hum was a living thing, vibrating the air around them, resonating in their bones, as if warning them to turn back. Graves and Samara reached the steel door, a massive, rusted barrier that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Yet they both knew what lay beyond was not forgotten. It was imprisoned, waiting. Graves placed his hand on the door, and it was ice cold, sending a shiver up his spine. He glanced at Samara, her face pale but determined, and nodded. Together, they pushed the door open with a creaking groan that echoed down the corridor like a death knell. The room beyond was vast, far larger than it should have been, given the dimensions of the hospital. The ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with ancient, occult symbols that glowed faintly with a sickly green light. In the center of the room was a massive black stone altar, pulsating with a dark energy that made the air around it shimmer. On the altar lay a heart, a large, blackened organ, beating slowly, each throb sending out waves of malevolence that made the very air vibrate. The heart was connected to the walls by thick, twisted veins that pulsed in time with it, feeding the hospital's dark power. "This is it," Graves whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. "The heart of St. Maercy." As they stepped closer, the heart's beats grew louder, faster, as if sensing their intent. The air around them grew thick, oppressive, and it felt like the room itself was closing in, suffocating them. Suddenly, the doors behind them slammed shut, and the shadows in the room came alive. They twisted and writhed, taking form, figures with glowing red eyes, their bodies made of pure darkness, slowly circling them like predators. "They won't let us destroy it," Samara said, her voice trembling with fear. "We don't have a choice," Graves replied, pulling out a small, silver dagger he had taken from the surgical theater. "We end this now." With a roar, Graves charged the altar, raising the dagger high. The shadowy figures lunged, their claws slashing through the air, but Samara was ready. She grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor and swung it wildly, keeping them at bay. Graves reached the altar and plunged the dagger into the heart. The moment the blade pierced the flesh, the room erupted in chaos. The heart convulsed, dark blood spraying from the wound, and the walls shook violently as if the entire hospital was being torn apart. The shadowy figures screamed in agony, their forms disintegrating into clouds of black smoke that dissipated into the air. The veins connected to the heart shriveled and died, the dark energy flowing through them weakening with each passing second. Graves twisted the dagger deeper into the heart, and with a final, deafening thud, the organs stopped beating. The hum ceased, and an unnatural silence fell over the room. But the victory was short-lived. The walls began to crack, pieces of the ceiling crumbling and falling around them. The entire hospital was collapsing, its lifeblood drained, its power broken. "We have to get out of here," Samara screamed, grabbing Graves' arm. They ran, dodging falling debris, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The room behind them was consumed by darkness, the last remnants of the hospital's malevolent energy imploding as the heart finally died. They burst through the steel door and into the corridor, racing toward the elevator. But the building was falling apart around them, and as they reached the elevator, the ground gave way beneath them. Graves grabbed Samara's hand, pulling her up as they clung to the edge of the collapsing floor. With one final effort, they heaved themselves up and into the elevator, just as the floor below them crumbled into the abyss. The doors closed, and the elevator shot upwards, the sound of the hospital's destruction fading behind them. When the doors opened, they found themselves back in the atrium, now eerily quiet. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a deathly silence that filled the entire building. They stumbled outside into the daylight, breathing in the fresh air, free from the stench of decay and blood. St. Maercy Hospital was no more. The nightmare had ended, but as they looked back at the crumbling ruins, they couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching them from the shadows.